A stranger leaves a note on Keanu Reeves' windshield. Just 7 words. They're tearing down Frank's garage tomorrow. The man who raised him, the place that made him. What Keanu does next uncovers a legacy no one saw coming and reveals how one quiet man changed countless lives without ever asking for credit. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The streets of Toronto had the hush of early autumn, the kind where the leaves barely rustled, but you could feel the air shifting, like the city was bracing for something unseen. Keanu Reeves, dressed simply in jeans and a worn jacket, pulled into a quiet side street just outside an old corner cafe. No one noticed him. That's how he liked it. He stepped inside, ordered black coffee, and sat near the window. No script, no meeting, no fanfare. Just a weekend to breathe. He didn't come back often, but something had pulled him in this time, a restlessness he couldn't name. 15 minutes later, he walked back to his car. The breeze had picked up. He was reaching for the handle when he saw it. A white envelope, tucked under the windshield wiper. He paused. There was no stamp, no address, just his name written in slanted block letters. Keanu. He peeled it off the glass and looked around the street. No one lingered nearby. No one watched. Curious, he slipped into the driver's seat and opened the letter carefully. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded once. The handwriting was rough but steady, the kind that looked like it came from someone who worked with their hands more than their words. It read, "Mr. Reeves, the garage where Frank taught us is being torn down next week. Figured you'd want to know. Leo Carlton, class of '92. Keanu stared at it. The garage. Frank's garage. 1,000 images flashed through his mind. Grease-stained coveralls, the smell of motor oil and old wood, Frank's quiet nod when he got something right, the soft clang of tools being returned to drawers. He folded the letter again, slower this time, hands suddenly heavier. Leo Carlton. That name stirred something. A skinny kid with big glasses who never said much, but always stayed late to help. Frank never turned anyone away, especially not the kids who had nowhere else to be. Keanu leaned back in his seat, the coffee going cold beside him. That place wasn't just a garage, it was a sanctuary, a classroom, a second home for boys who needed more than just mechanical skills. For boys like him. Keanu didn't wait. The next morning he canceled his meetings, rented a modest car, and made the drive west, back to the neighborhood where his life had quietly taken shape. The farther he got from the city center, the more familiar everything became. Old intersections, a gas station that hadn't changed since the '80s, the kind of places where memory wasn't a flashback. It was the pavement under your tires. As he pulled onto the street where the garage still stood, the world around him seemed smaller, slower. Houses leaned with age. Yards weren't perfect, but they were lived in. The sign above the garage door was barely legible now, rusted metal with letters fading into the wood. Frank's garage. Open doors? He stepped out and just stood there. The building hadn't changed much. A little smaller than he remembered, the paint was peeling, one of the windows was cracked, but the smell of oil and metal was still faintly there, like the past hadn't fully left. Keanu walked to the door and pressed his hand against it. Inside it was dark, but the layout was still etched into his mind. The workbench to the right, the mismatched toolboxes, the floor tiles patched over time. Dust floated in the sunlight that streamed through the cracks. Then he saw it. A wall of Polaroids, old, faded, curling at the edges. Photos of kids, some holding wrenches, others laughing in grease-streaked shirts. Most were nameless to him now, but the feeling was immediate. These were the lives Frank had touched. Boys who became men, lost kids who found a path. Keanu spotted one that made him freeze. It was a photo of him, no older than 12. He was standing next to Frank, both of them covered in grime, holding up a freshly rebuilt engine block like they'd just landed on the moon. He hadn't remembered the picture, but now, seeing it again, something inside him cracked open. Leo had been right to send the letter. This place didn't need saving because of nostalgia. It needed saving because it had saved so many others first. Keanu stood in that space for what felt like hours. The stillness wasn't empty. It was heavy, like it remembered every voice, every moment. He walked slowly toward the workbench, running his hand along its edge. The old gouges were still there, one from when he dropped a hammer at 13, one where Frank slammed a wrench too hard after learning one of the boys had been suspended for fighting. That bench had seen everything. Near the back wall, he found a small box tucked beneath a shelf. Inside were notes. Handwritten slips from kids who passed through the garage over the years. Some were barely legible, scribbled in pencil. Others were longer thank you messages, sketches, even dreams, written out like blueprints. Thanks for letting me come even when I messed up. Someday I'll open my own shop, just like this. You never yelled, just made me want to do better. Keanu pressed his lips together, fighting the lump in his throat. That's when he heard the footsteps. He turned toward the door and saw a man about his age step into the light. Tall, salt and pepper hair, a bit of a limp. You came, the man said, holding out his hand. Leo Carlton. Keanu took it without hesitation. Thank you for the letter. Leo smiled faintly. Didn't know if you'd remember me. I do now, Keanu said. They sat together on overturned milk crates in the middle of the garage. Leo shared how he'd been teaching high school shop for almost 15 years now. Everything I know, he said, started here. Frank didn't just show us how to fix engines. He taught us how to stay standing when life got messy. Keanu nodded slowly. He did that for me too. I thought you should see it one more time, Leo said quietly, before the city tears it down. They're putting up condos. Keanu looked around again. The garage was tired, worn, but still breathing in a way only old places filled with love could be. Frank would have never asked to be remembered, Leo added, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Keanu looked over at the wall of photos again. His eyes landed back on the one of him and Frank. That day had felt like a win, like he mattered. And now, all these years later, the moment came back clearer than ever. We're not letting them tear it down, he said finally. Leo blinked. What? We're going to save it, Keanu said, and we're going to make sure people remember exactly what this place really was. He stood up, heart pounding, not with nerves, but with purpose, a fire he hadn't felt in years. Not for a film, not for an award, but for something that had shaped his soul long before the world ever knew his name. This wasn't just about the garage. This was about Frank. The drive back to the block felt like rewinding a tape. The streets were narrower than he remembered, the houses closer together. Time had pressed everything inward, softening the edges and dulling the color. The bakery on the corner was now boarded up. The convenience store had a different name, but the cracked sidewalk outside the old bus stop still had the faded chalk marks from years ago, layered ghosts of hopscotch squares and summer drawings. Keanu slowed down as he turned onto the narrow lane where Frank's garage had stood for nearly half a century. The building was still there, but it looked exhausted. The roof sagged slightly, the paint peeled in sheets, and the sign, once bold and hopeful, now hung crooked above the bay doors. Frank's garage. Open doors, open hearts. The words were barely legible, but the memory was sharp. He parked across the street, engine ticking as it cooled. For a long time, he didn't move, just stared at the front of the shop like it might speak. In a way, it already had. His hand tightened around the steering wheel, but his mind slipped backward, pulled through time like gravity. He saw himself again. Maybe 9 or 10, standing beside Patricia as she knocked on the garage door the first time. Frank had opened it with his usual calm, greasy hands, worn cap, kind eyes. He hadn't smiled, but his nod had been enough. Keanu had been shy, quiet. He didn't want to be there. Patricia had explained they were struggling. She was working 2 jobs, and Keanu needed somewhere safe after school. Frank had listened, then looked down at the boy, who wouldn't meet his eyes. "You ever held a wrench?" Frank asked. Keanu had shaken his head. Frank had turned and walked back into the garage, tossing the words over his shoulder like they weren't a test. "Then it's time you learned." From that day forward, Keanu had shown up every afternoon. No one told him to. It just felt like the place you returned to when you didn't know where else to go. The memory deepened. He could almost hear the slow clack of tools being returned to their trays, the low hum of the old radio Frank always left on in the background. There wasn't much talking in those early days, just presence. The steady kind. Frank never hovered, he didn't give pep talks, but he noticed everything. When Keanu was frustrated, when he was proud, when he just needed something to do with his hands. Keanu started with small things, sweeping the floor, organizing parts, watching quietly as Frank explained to other kids how to diagnose a faulty alternator or patch a leaking radiator. Over time, he learned by watching and by messing up. One time he dropped an oil pan, splattering grease all over his pants. He'd frozen, embarrassed, waiting for Frank's scolding, but Frank had just looked over, nodded once, and said, "Now you know how not to do it." That was how it always went. Mistakes weren't punished, they were part of the process. And slowly, the garage became something more. Not just a place to kill time, but a place where things made sense. Where you could take something broken and, with enough patience, make it work again. Other kids came and went. Some were tough, some were quiet, some carried stories on their backs too heavy for their age. But Frank treated them all the same. He gave them tools, tasks, trust. And in doing so, gave them something else, dignity. Keanu remembered one boy in particular, Marcus, who'd been struggling in school and had a short fuse. Frank handed him a carburetor one day and said, "Take it apart, every piece. Then tell me what it means." Marcus had stared at him, confused. "It's not about the engine," Frank added. "It's about how you handle what's complicated." By the end of that week, Marcus had taken the whole thing apart and put it back together better than anyone else. Keanu's mind drifted again to a quiet Saturday when he'd come in alone, hours before Frank usually opened up. His hands had been shaking. His father had called the night before for the first time in months, saying nothing helpful, just enough to stir old pain. Keanu had come to the garage because it was the only place where silence didn't feel empty. Frank had arrived early, seen the look in Keanu's eyes, and without a word, handed him a pair of gloves and pointed to a dusty engine block. "Want to work it out?" he asked. And they had, side by side, saying almost nothing. But when the engine finally turned over, Keanu had looked at Frank, and Frank had only said, "Some things aren't meant to be fixed fast. They're meant to be understood." That was the day Keanu stopped seeing the garage as a temporary shelter. It became something more. His compass, a place where doing good work, showing up, helping others, those were the unspoken rules. They weren't listed on any wall, but they ran through every bolt, every smudge of oil, every sigh of a kid who finally believed in himself again. Now, standing in that same space decades later, Keanu felt the gravity of it all. The city might see this as just a shell, an old structure that had outlived its use. But Keanu saw something sacred, a place that had caught him when life was uncertain, a place that had offered steady hands and second chances. He walked to the wall where the old repair charts used to hang. Instead, there was a faded bulletin board with curling edges and pushpins still holding on to scraps of memory. One was a flyer for a long-past neighborhood barbecue. Another was a note written in a child's handwriting. "Thank you, Frank, for believing in me." Keanu's throat tightened. That garage didn't need saving for his sake. It needed saving because Frank's spirit still lived there, in the stories, in the scraps, in the generations who passed through and left better than they came. And as Keanu turned to leave, he made a quiet vow under his breath. He wasn't going to let it disappear. Keanu stepped deeper into the garage, letting the light from the open bay door stretch long shadows behind him. Dust shimmered in the still air. The deeper he went, the more memory tugged at him, like the walls themselves were whispering stories. And then he saw it. A full wall on the far end of the garage, behind a rolling shelf of unused tires, was covered in Polaroid photos. Dozens, maybe hundreds, taped, tacked, and stapled in no particular order. Some were sun-faded, others curled at the corners. Most had a name scribbled beneath in blue or black pen, first names, nicknames, ages. Marcus, age 14. Geo, the Bolt Whisperer. Sandra, 13. Best brake bleeder in town. Keanu approached slowly. Some of the faces he recognized, others he didn't. But every one of them had the same look in their eyes, a mixture of uncertainty and quiet pride. You could tell these weren't photos taken at their best. They were taken while they were learning, sweating, becoming. In the corner of the wall, he found his own photo again. Younger than he remembered himself being. Grease on his cheek, a shy smile, and Frank's steady hand resting on his shoulder. "Still there, huh?" came a voice behind him. Keanu turned to see Leo standing in the doorway, holding 2 coffees. "I didn't know this was here," Keanu said quietly. Leo nodded. Most people didn't. Frank never showed it off. But if you ever asked what he was most proud of, he'd point at this wall. Keanu took the coffee and looked back. "It's like a family tree." "Exactly," Leo said, "except this family was built with wrenches and kindness." They walked along the wall together, Leo pointing out names. "That one's Jason. He went into the Navy. Said Frank was the reason he straightened out. Over there? Clara. Runs her own auto shop now. She hires kids nobody else will. Sound familiar?" Keanu smiled. It did. Leo paused in front of one photo and touched it gently. "That's me. 15. Just got suspended for mouthing off to a teacher. My mom was furious. Dropped me here the next day." "And Frank?" Keanu asked. "Said nothing. Just handed me a wrench and told me to start on the rear axle of a '76 Buick." Leo chuckled. "I didn't know what a rear axle was." "But you learned," Keanu said. "Yeah," Leo replied. "But it wasn't just the cars. It was the way he looked at you. Like you already had value. Like he wasn't waiting for you to become something. You already were something." They walked toward the back of the garage where a rusted toolbox sat beneath a broken window. Leo opened it. The top tray still held old sockets, lined up with care. Beneath that was a folded sheet of yellowed paper, with grease smudges at the edges. Leo handed it to Keanu. He used to keep a list, names of the kids who came through. I think he just didn't want to forget. Keanu unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was firm, but tired. Names, dates, a few notes beside each. Jorge, quick hands, angry heart. Alina, eyes like she's always bracing for something. Leo, stubborn, needs steady ground. Keanu, quieter than he lets on. Smart, just needs time. Keanu swallowed hard, blinking against the lump in his throat. "It saw us," Leo said, "before we knew how to see ourselves." There was a long silence between them, just the sound of an old beam creaking in the roof, the hum of distant traffic outside. "You ever think about how many people he changed?" Keanu asked. "All the time," Leo replied. "Some of us became teachers, some mechanics. One kid even went into social work. Frank never made speeches, he didn't write books. He just gave us a place to become." Keanu folded the paper again and tucked it into his coat. "I never wanted credit," he said. Leo shook his head. He didn't care about that. He just wanted to know that something good would keep going. Leo and Keanu stood quietly, their eyes still on the wall of names. Outside, the sky had shifted. The gray light of afternoon slanted through the gaps in the siding, casting golden streaks across the concrete floor. It felt like time was holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. Keanu walked to the workbench where Frank used to stand, arms folded, letting the kids figure things out for themselves. He ran his hand along the worn wood, still stained with oil and paint and the stories of those who passed through. Then he turned back to Leo. "Do they know?" Keanu asked. "Who?" "All the people on that wall." Leo exhaled, looking at the names again. "Some probably don't. Some left town, some maybe never looked back. But a few, yeah, they remember. Just like we do." Keanu nodded slowly. Then he reached for his phone and opened his contacts. "I want to call them." Leo looked at him, eyebrows raised. "I want to find whoever we can, the ones still around. I want them to see this place again, before it's gone." Leo didn't hesitate. "I'll help." They started planning right then, scribbling names from memory, calling old neighbors, texting people they hadn't heard from in decades. The response was almost immediate. "Frank's garage? I'll be there." "Saved me. I'll come. I owe him more than he ever knew." Some couldn't travel, some were out of reach, but enough responded to make it real. By the end of the week, they had a list, a plan, and a date. As Keanu folded the paper and slid it into his jacket, Leo placed a hand on the workbench and said, "You know, I think Frank would have said this is what it was all for. Not the bolts, not the brakes, but this. Connection." Keanu smiled. "Then let's keep it connected." He turned one last time toward the wall of Polaroids. His younger self stared back through time, grease on his face, hope in his eyes. He reached up and gently straightened the photo, the corner curling slightly with age. "We're not done yet," he whispered. Then he and Leo stepped out into the fading light, the garage door creaking closed behind them. One last time, for now. But they both knew it wouldn't stay closed for long. The next morning, Keanu drove to the quiet house where his mother, Patricia, still lived. The neighborhood had changed over the years. New stores, fresh paint on old fences, but her house remained largely the same. The faded green trim, the creaky gate, and the smell of rosemary near the porch. It was all memory made solid. The place where life had been both fragile and strong. She opened the door in a thick cardigan, a teacup in one hand, her eyes lighting up with a mix of joy and surprise. "You didn't tell me you were coming." "I didn't plan to," Keanu said as he kissed her cheek. Something came up. They sat on the living room couch, the heater humming from the corner vent and the familiar tick of the old clock echoing softly. On the mantel were family photos, some recent, some yellowed with time. There was one of Keanu in middle school, holding a wrench, Frank's hand resting just behind his shoulder. Keanu's eyes caught it, and Patricia noticed. "I went to the garage," he said finally. She didn't answer, just looked at him over her glasses. "They're going to tear it down." That pulled a sharp breath from her. She set the cup down gently on its saucer and looked toward the curtained window, as if the news had landed like a stone in her chest. She stayed silent for a long moment. "I always knew that day might come," she said quietly, "but it still feels like losing him again." Keanu leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I walked through it yesterday. It still smelled like oil and dust and whatever it was he used to clean carburetors, but more than that, it felt like it still remembered us." Patricia nodded, her hands folded tightly now. "That place held so many parts of us." She looked down into her lap, eyes misting. "There was a night," she whispered, "when you were maybe 7. It was bitter cold. The car wouldn't start. I didn't have enough for heat or groceries. I was done. I sat on the kitchen floor and cried." Keanu swallowed, saying nothing. "And then Frank showed up," she continued. "Didn't knock, just walked in, saw me, and without a word made me a grilled cheese sandwich. Then he went out and fixed the furnace." She smiled, eyes shimmering. "He didn't fix with noise. He fixed with presence." Keanu sat back, letting her words sink in. The heater let out a low sigh in the corner, and the silence in the room felt like a space carved out for remembering. "Ham never made things dramatic," Keanu finally said. "Even when we were..." Patricia chuckled, her eyes still damp. You were dramatic, all right, especially when you thought the world ended over a scraped knee or not getting that school play. Keanu laughed too, softly, and Frank would just hand me a rag and say, "Then clean up the mess." Patricia tilted her head. That's what made him different. He didn't speak in long sentences. He lived in small acts. Keanu reached for a picture on the mantel, one he hadn't noticed before. It was him, around 10, standing beside Frank in front of the garage. Grease on his shirt, a smudge on his cheek, but grinning. Frank wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking at Keanu. "You kept this?" Keanu asked. "Of course. That day, you got the timing belt off by yourself. You looked so proud, and Frank looked like he already knew you were going to be something more." Keanu stared at it, overcome. "I was so young, but I remember that day. I remember thinking, he didn't care if I was good at it, he just liked being there." Patricia nodded. "He showed up, that was his gift." Keanu returned the photo to the shelf. He never talked about himself. I knew he'd been through things, war, heartbreak, loss, but he never said much. "I believed fixing someone else's problem was the best way to forget your own," Patricia said quietly. "But deep down, I think he was still healing too." The room grew still again. Even the heater paused. "He once told me," Patricia added, "that you don't raise a child with answers, you raise them with steadiness. He said he never had that growing up, but he hoped he gave it to you." Keanu looked down, then back up at his mother. "He did." Patricia took a long sip of tea, her hand trembling slightly. "Then maybe it's your turn now." Keanu didn't respond, but she didn't need him to. The look in his eyes told her everything. That evening, as dusk settled across the rooftops, Keanu stayed for dinner. Patricia had made her usual lentil stew with warm bread, and though simple, it tasted like home. After they ate, she disappeared into the hallway and returned with an old tin box, one Keanu hadn't seen in years. "What's that?" he asked as she set it in front of him. "Frank kept this tucked away in the garage. After he passed, I brought it here. I didn't open it until a few weeks ago." The lid creaked as she lifted it. Inside were scraps of life. Receipts for engine parts, faded photos of Keanu and his sister, tiny slips of paper with phone numbers written in Frank's scrawling print. But what drew Keanu's eye was a folded piece of brown paper, cracked along the seams. He opened it gently. It was a child's drawing, a garage with two stick figures, one labeled me, the other Frank. Above it, in shaky handwriting, "One day, I'll fix things too." Keanu smiled through a sting of emotion. "I forgot I drew this." Patricia didn't say anything. She just reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "People didn't," she whispered. Keanu looked down at the old paper, stained in the corner from age or oil. "He kept it?" Patricia nodded. "All these years." Keanu folded it carefully and returned it to the box. He sat back in his chair, thinking of that wall of Polaroids, the handwritten list in the drawer, the names remembered, and the lives touched. "Mom," he said after a long pause, "I don't want it to be torn down." "Then don't let it be," she said simply. "But it's more than just a building. It's a place where kids found purpose. Where I found purpose." Patricia looked him in the eye. "Then make sure it keeps doing that." He stared at her, and for a moment he wasn't Keanu Reeves, the world-famous actor. He was a son who had once watched a man fix a heater while the snow blew in from the cracks. A boy who had been handed a grilled cheese sandwich and a second chance. And now, it was his turn to fix something. Patricia rose from the table to make tea. Keanu remained seated, but his mind was already moving, reaching into the past and pulling something forward, something worth saving. By the time he left that night, the drawing was in his jacket pocket. The garage wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a mission. Keanu stood alone in Frank's old garage the next morning, the silence as thick as the motor oil that used to coat the floors, The scent of aged rubber and rust lingered. Dust floated in the beams of sunlight streaming through the high windows. His fingers trailed across the workbench, where dents and stains told stories even time couldn't wash away. That's when he saw it. Near the back wall, an old BMX bike frame, crooked and stripped of its tires, leaned against the shelf like it had always been there. It was missing a pedal, its paint was chipped, and one wheel hung loosely from a bent fork. But Keanu remembered that bike. Not because it was his, but because of the boy who once brought it in. He closed his eyes and let the memory rise. He was 10, maybe 11, sitting on the floor with his knees pulled up, watching Frank work on a carburetor. The air smelled like gasoline and sawdust. That afternoon, a boy about 2 years older than him had stormed in, kicking the garage door open with his foot. His jeans were torn, his eye bruised. "Got kicked out again," the boy muttered. Frank didn't blink, just looked up and asked, "What's the story?" The boy shrugged. "Principal says I've got an attitude." Frank looked at the bent bike in the boy's hands. The front tire wobbled like a drunken spin. "Looks like your bike's got one too." The boy chuckled for a second, then looked down. "I think it's done." Frank stood slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Not yet." They wheeled it inside, the older boy quiet now. Frank didn't ask questions. He didn't scold. He handed the boy a wrench and pointed to the crooked rim. "Let's start with the spokes." Keanu had watched it all, watched as the boy's frustration melted into focus, as his fists loosened into fingers learning to turn bolts and align metal. Frank barely spoke. But the boy stayed for 3 hours. By the end of the day, the wheel spun straight, and the boy had smiled. Later that evening, Frank leaned over to Keanu and said quietly, "It's never about the bike." Keanu, still a kid, didn't understand. But now, standing in the silence of the same garage, he finally did. Keanu stepped closer to the crooked bike and crouched down, running his hand along the frame. The rust flaked beneath his touch, but he smiled. This wasn't junk. It was proof. A story etched in steel. One of many. The sound of gravel crunching outside broke the silence. Keanu turned as the garage door creaked open. Leo stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee and a brown bag. "I figured you'd be back," Leo said, stepping inside. "Still smells like motor oil and regret." Keanu grinned. "And wisdom, don't forget that." Leo handed him one of the cups and nodded toward the bike. "You remember Marcus?" Keanu blinked. "That was his?" Leo nodded. "Yeah, he was a tough kid back then, always in trouble. But after that day with Frank, something shifted." "What happened to him?" "He's a paramedic now," Leo said. "Married, 2 kids, teaches CPR classes at the local rec center. Still rides a bike too, though not that one." Keanu looked back at the bent frame. "Frank never gave up on people." "Nope," Leo said. "He didn't talk much about your future, he just helped you build it one bolt at a time." They sipped their coffee in silence for a while, both lost in the stories the walls held. Then Leo walked toward the back, toward the wall of Polaroids. "I did some digging after I wrote you," Leo said. "Started calling some of the names. You know what I found?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. Out of the 36 kids Frank mentored in this garage, 24 of them went into service jobs. EMTs, mechanics, firefighters, even a middle school principal. Keanu looked at him, surprised. "You're serious?" Leo pulled out a folded list from his jacket. "I wrote their names, and every single one of them mentioned the same thing, that Frank never made them feel broken, even when they were." Keanu didn't speak. He didn't need to. The gravity of what Frank had done, quietly, without recognition, settled in his chest. Leo walked back to him and said, "This place changed lives. Yours, mine, dozens of others. It doesn't deserve to be forgotten." Keanu nodded slowly. "Then we won't let it be." He looked back at the crooked bike one more time. "It was never about the bike," he whispered again. And this time, he knew exactly what that meant. Later that day, Keanu and Leo sat at the front of the garage, their legs stretched out across the cement lip of the entryway. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the concrete, warming the peeling paint on the garage doors. "You ever wonder," Leo said, "what made Frank stay?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He stared out at the quiet street, the same one he used to ride down on his way to school. The trees were taller now, the sidewalks cracked, but the spirit of the place was unchanged. "I used to think it was just what he knew. Tools, grease, gears," Keanu said. "But I think it's because he saw something worth fixing in people." Leo nodded. He fixed more than engines. Keanu pulled out the old Polaroid he'd taken from the wall inside. One of Marcus and Frank standing together, both covered in grease and smiling like they'd just won the Indy 500. "I wonder how many kids came here broken," Keanu said, "and left thinking maybe they weren't beyond repair." Leo leaned back against the wall. "Probably all of us." Just then, a car pulled up slowly along the curb. A woman stepped out, holding the hand of a teenage boy. She looked around, then walked toward the garage. Leo stood up to greet her. "You must be Keanu," she said softly. "I saw your name on the article about Frank's garage. My brother used to come here." "His name was Jamal." Keanu rose and shook her hand. Her eyes were wet. "El died 3 years ago, but he talked about this place all the time. Said it was the first place he ever felt seen." She reached into her purse and pulled out a photo. A younger Jamal, smiling, a wrench in one hand and his other arm thrown over Frank's shoulder. Frank's face was the same, calm, grounded, warm. "I just want to say thank you for remembering." Keanu swallowed hard, nodding. "It's not just remembering, it's continuing." The woman smiled, then looked at her son. "I told him about this place. He wants to learn." Keanu looked at the boy, maybe 12, quiet, curious, hopeful. He smiled and held open the garage door. "Then let's get started," he said. And as the boy stepped inside, the sunlight caught the bent bike frame near the wall. Still waiting, still standing, just like Frank always did. The meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m., but Keanu arrived at the small city hall building nearly 30 minutes early. The outside was quiet, the sidewalks damp from a brief rain, the lampposts casting long reflections on the wet pavement. He paused at the steps, looking up at the municipal crest etched above the doors. A crest he'd walked under as a teenager, never imagining he'd return with a proposal that might change everything. Inside, the room was modest. Rows of plastic chairs lined the floor, and a low dais held 5 council members' seats. The town clerk shuffled papers behind a scratched wooden desk. Keanu entered quietly, dressed in a dark jacket and worn jeans. No entourage, no spotlight. Just a folded proposal in hand and the weight of a legacy behind him. One by one, the council members filtered in. Their expressions were polite, curious. Whispers floated through the room as a few local residents recognized him and nudged one another. But Keanu didn't respond. He was here not as a celebrity, but as Frank Donovan's student. Leo arrived and stood near the back wall, joined by a small group of others who had once been garage kids, now grown men and women with lives shaped, in part, by an old mechanic who never asked for thanks. When the mayor called his name, Keanu stood and approached the podium. His voice was calm, steady, but laced with emotion. "Good evening. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'm here about Parcel 12B, Frank's garage." One councilman raised an eyebrow. "Yes, that structure is due for demolition. The site's been approved for a condo development, 60 units. Keanu nodded slightly. "I've seen the plans, and I know the town needs housing, but I'm asking you to reconsider for something just as vital." He opened his folder and gently laid out photos, faded Polaroids, news clippings, hand-drawn sketches from a child's hand. They fluttered softly as he placed them down. "This garage," he said, holding up one image, "is where I learned how to change oil, how to fix a belt, how to listen, how to try again. And I wasn't the only one." He turned toward the council. Frank Donovan didn't just repair engines. He repaired people. Quietly, one kid at a time. The audience fell still. He never charged for advice. He never locked the doors. Frank made time, not noise. That garage became a sanctuary for dozens of us. And I want to save it, restore it, reimagine it, not as a monument, but as a living space, a workshop center, a mentorship hub, a place where kids today can come and feel what we felt: useful, hopeful, seen. A younger councilwoman leaned forward. And how would this be funded? Personally, Keanu said, fully, from my own foundation, all renovations, equipment, staff, utilities, with no liability to the city. And if I can't follow through, I'll leave a binding grant in escrow to cover every cost. Murmurs echoed across the chamber. One older councilman leaned into his microphone. Mr. Reeves, that garage is structurally unsound. The developer's offer includes sidewalks, lighting, safety upgrades, things this town actually needs. Keanu didn't flinch. I've consulted 2 engineers. The garage can be reinforced. The land accommodates both the garage and a small green space for community use. I've worked with urban planners. The renovation won't burden the town. It'll enrich it. But why save that specific building? The man asked again, almost exasperated. It's just an old shop. Keanu stepped closer to the microphone. Because it's not just wood and nails. It's the first place I saw someone value effort over pedigree. Where failure wasn't shameful, it was fixable. Frank made space for broken things, not just parts, people. And we need more of that. He paused, then held up a small rusted bolt from his jacket pocket. This, he said, was the first thing I ever fixed. I still carry it, not because it's valuable, but because it reminds me of where I started. His voice softened. I never asked Frank for anything, but somehow he gave me everything, and I've spent years trying to live up to the quiet example he left. Leo stepped forward from the back of the room and raised his hand. The mayor nodded, and Leo spoke. I'm a public school teacher now. I used to be one of those garage kids. The only reason I stayed in school was because Frank taught me how to finish something. He didn't yell, he just expected better. He turned to the audience. I can name 30 people who wouldn't be where they are now without that garage. A nurse in scrubs stood next. He fixed my brother's scooter when we couldn't afford repairs. Then he let him sweep floors and taught him mechanics. My brother's a shop owner now. A man in a fireman's jacket rose. I was headed to jail before Frank gave me a wrench and said, let's try something different. That shop saved my life. Voices grew louder. Applause broke out. One council member looked visibly moved. The mayor held up a hand. All right, we hear you. Mr. Reeves, your proposal is compelling. We'll need time to review the legal documents, funding statements, and property plans. They're all included, Keanu said, nodding to the folder, along with architectural blueprints, letters of support from trade schools, and a sustainability plan. The mayor smiled slightly. You came prepared. Keanu offered a small smile back. Frank wouldn't have let me walk in unprepared. Laughter rippled gently through the room. Do you have a name in mind for the new center? The mayor asked. Keanu looked down at the photos on the podium, then back up. The Frank Donovan Youth Workshop, with the same sign above the door it always had. Open doors, open hearts. The councilwoman who'd remained quiet now leaned in. You know, we get a lot of people offering money. Not many offering legacy. The room fell silent again. One by one, heads nodded. No official vote was cast that night, but the message was clear. Keanu stepped back from the podium to soft, rising applause. It wasn't thunderous, it wasn't dramatic, but it was the kind of applause Frank would have appreciated most. Quiet, earned, and full of purpose. The article first appeared in the local weekly paper, buried on page 4 beneath a story about sidewalk repairs. The headline was short: Keanu Reeves proposes youth garage in honor of local mechanic. A photo showed him standing in front of the old shop, one hand resting on the crooked sign, the other holding a folder. No smiles, just a look of quiet determination. But the story didn't stay local for long. By Monday morning, the piece had been shared online, reposted by a Toronto-based news anchor who captioned it, "A real hero for a real man." From there, it caught fire. The next day, a major news site published a full-length feature, "The Garage That Built Keanu Reeves." Within hours, thousands were commenting. And then the messages started coming in. Frank Donovan's name had never trended online before, but suddenly it did. People began replying with stories, dozens, then hundreds. One woman wrote, "Frank let me use his garage to work on my art projects when my mom got sick. He told me to make something that lasts. I'm now a sculptor in Montreal. He never even knew I made it." Another man posted a photo of himself in a paramedic uniform. "I used to skip class. Frank gave me a busted first aid kit and told me to figure it out. He said every tool tells you what it wants to do if you listen." He was talking about people. In a small kitchen in Nova Scotia, a retired firefighter named Reggie blinked twice when his wife showed him the article. "That's Frank's boy," he said. "I haven't seen him since the day he rebuilt my courage." Reggie picked up the phone. 2 hours later, a local reporter showed up at his door. Reggie told her about the day he nearly quit the academy, how Frank fixed the brakes on his old station wagon while listening to him spiral about self-doubt. Frank never gave a speech. He just said, "Fire knows when you fear it, so don't give it that." Reggie made it through. He served 32 years. The interview aired that night. By the following weekend, national media had picked it up. A teacher from Hamilton stood in front of a faded yearbook photo and said, "Frank taught me how to hold a socket wrench, but he also taught me how to stay when everything else told me to run." One by one, the stories painted a mosaic, not of celebrity, not of Keanu, but of the man behind the garage. A man who fixed more than machines. Local businesses started changing their signs. The bakery 2 blocks down added a chalkboard quote. Frank said, "The best things rise slow." The hardware store displayed his photo in the window. A diner posted a sign on the counter. "Frank Donovan ate here, and he always left a tip." At Town Hall, the council members received over 2,000 emails in a single week. Some offered tools, some offered paint. Many just said, "Thank you for remembering him." Leo, who had stayed out of the spotlight, found himself answering calls from kids he hadn't seen in decades. "Did you hear?" they'd say. "I was one of Frank's too." And then something unexpected happened. A teenager named Ava, barely 16, posted a TikTok video after visiting the garage site with her grandfather. Her voice shook as she recorded, showing the peeling paint and rusted hinges. "This is where my grandpa said he learned to believe in himself. Frank told him he wasn't useless. So today I came here to say thank you. If you're watching this, just know, good men." The video hit 2 million views in 48 hours. Underneath, comments flooded in. "My dad was one of his. I wish I had a Frank in my town. I'm crying in a hardware store right now." With every share, the story stretched farther, across provinces, across oceans. In British Columbia, a former electrician mailed a hand-graved plaque that read, "For the man who tightened the bolts we didn't know were loose." In Newfoundland, a group of retired mechanics started collecting donations at their local auto club. "Frank's garage taught the trade with dignity," their flyer read. "Let's return the favor." Keanu received a letter from a woman in Saskatchewan. She enclosed a single Polaroid. It showed a 6-year-old boy with a missing front tooth, standing proudly beside a crooked birdhouse. The note read, "Frank said it wasn't about straight lines. It was about steady hands. That boy became an architect. He's my son, and Frank never knew. Please let his legacy live." Inside the garage, things began to shift. Leo and a few others, some of them teachers, some of them tradesmen, began organizing, cleaning out cobwebs, cataloging the Polaroids on the wall, scrubbing down the workbenches. A chalkboard went up near the entrance. At the top, it said, "What did Frank teach you?" Beneath it, visitors began writing in chalk. How to show up even when you're tired. How to hold a screwdriver in your temper. That everyone deserves a second try. Keanu returned a few days later and stood quietly, reading each line. He didn't say much, just added his own near the bottom. That silence can be louder than shouting. The city council, overwhelmed by public support, moved quickly to approve the restoration. Permits were expedited. The developer withdrew with grace, saying, "Some buildings carry more than profit. This is one of them." In an act that surprised many, the same councilman who once dismissed the garage as just an old shop appeared in a televised segment wearing a Frank's Garage cap. He looked directly at the camera and said, "I was wrong. That shop isn't about the past. It's about the kind of future we all forgot we could build." More donations poured in. A group of teenage students in Toronto began a GoFundMe, not because the project needed the money, but because they wanted to say thank you. In 2 days, they raised enough to fund the first full year of youth programs. On one live stream, Keanu spoke briefly. "I think we live in a world where it's easy to forget the quiet ones. But Frank reminded us that the quiet ones often hold the most. I'm not doing this because I'm famous. I'm doing this because I was once just a kid with no compass. And Frank became mine." The stream ended with a photo montage. Frank leaning against a car hood, arms crossed. A young Keanu sanding down a bike frame. A workbench covered in scattered screws and a coffee cup. The final frame, the new sign being painted. Frank's Garage, open doors, open hearts, Est. 1974, reopened 2025. The town changed that week. Not because of fame, not because of money, but because one man's steady kindness had rippled far enough to return years later with the force of a community finally ready to remember. The morning sun filtered through the dusty garage windows, casting soft, golden lines across the floor. Keanu stood near the rear wall, the scent of old rubber and machine oil still lingering in the air. He had been helping clean and sort tools with a few volunteers, moving slowly, taking his time. Everything inside this place felt sacred. Even the rusted bolts seemed to whisper stories of yesterday. He reached a corner cabinet half covered by a sheet, its edges curled with time. Tugging it aside, Keanu found an old toolbox. Gray, dented, the kind of box meant to live forever on a workbench. The latch was slightly jammed. He jiggled it open, expecting dust and empty sockets. Instead, what he saw pulled him to the floor. Inside, the tools weren't just thrown in, they were arranged, labeled, prepared. Each wrench, screwdriver, and ratchet had a tag tied to it with string. Faded manila paper with Frank's unmistakable handwriting. The first tag read, "Wench teaches patience." Keanu picked it up slowly, like it might fall apart in his hands. The next was a socket set, lined precisely in order. The note attached read, "Set. Teaches problem solving." He blinked, trying to focus, but the notes were starting to blur. One by one, he read each tag. Rubber mallet, teaches control, not force. Pliers, teaches precision. President wrenched. Everything doesn't have to fit the first time. Each tool carried more than a function. It carried a lesson. Something Frank had known. Something he had hoped someone would discover one day. In the second drawer, Keanu found an old tape measure marked, "Respect. Always measure twice." And in the third drawer, a simple claw hammer. The tag said, "Strength is earned, not assumed." Keanu sat down beside the box, breath slow and uneven. He felt like he was 13 again, hands oily, knees scraped, desperate to earn the nod Frank gave when something was done right. This wasn't just a toolbox. It was a teaching kit, a lifetime's philosophy, condensed into tools and notes. And he hadn't even gotten to the last drawer yet. Keanu reached for the final drawer with a kind of reverence. He paused before opening it, as if something inside might change him. When he pulled it open, the hinges gave a low groan. Inside, nestled alone, was a worn photograph. It was small, square, and slightly curled at the edges. Black smudges darkened the corners and a faint grease stain crossed the bottom, but the image was unmistakable. A teenage Keanu, maybe 13 or 14. His hair was longer, messier. He was grinning wide, oil smudged across his cheek like a warrior's paint. In his hands he held up a crooked bike frame, half rebuilt, still missing its front wheel. Behind him, Frank's shoulder was barely in frame, but Keanu remembered the moment clearly. Frank had taken that photo after they'd finally gotten the gears to stop slipping. He hadn't said much, just gave a quiet nod and clicked the Polaroid. At the time, Keanu hadn't thought it meant anything. But here it was, saved, stored, protected. His fingers trembled as he held it. The memory hit hard. That day had felt ordinary, nothing special. Just another afternoon at the garage, sweat drying on their backs, the distant hum of a radio playing Marvin Gaye through tinny speakers. And yet, Frank had chosen that moment to keep. Not a graduation, not a birthday, just a simple, honest day of effort. Keanu sat down slowly on the garage stool, the photo in one hand and the wrench in the other. He felt something shift inside him, like grief and pride and love were all trying to take up the same space in his chest. The weight of it made him fold forward, elbows on knees. "God, Frank," he whispered. No camera crew, no crowd, no speeches. Just the sound of birds outside and the faint scent of engine oil in the air. Behind him, the garage was quiet. Leo hadn't come in yet. The others were still hauling out broken tires from the back lot. Keanu was alone with the box, and for the first time in years, he felt like the student again, sitting at the feet of someone who'd taught without ever holding a chalkboard. A teacher who never needed applause, just tools and time and faith. Keanu gathered the tools back into the box with care, placing each one exactly where Frank had left it. He tied the tags gently, straightened the Polaroid, and closed the lid. The box was heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in meaning. He carried it to the center of the garage floor and set it down. Then he stood and looked around. The old shop was dim and dusty, but now he saw it with new eyes. This wasn't a building, it was a legacy. The oil-stained floor, the dented lockers, the pegboard with tools still hanging by habit more than hook. Everything in here told the story of a man who didn't need a spotlight to make an impact. Frank had poured himself into every kid who walked through these doors, including Keanu. He moved toward the front of the garage, wiping his hands on a shop towel the way Frank used to. The breeze pushed through the open doors and rustled the corner of the tarp covering the "Frank's Garage" sign. Keanu walked up, lifted the edge, and let the sunlight hit the faded paint. Then he smiled. A quiet resolve began to form. This garage wasn't going to disappear, not while he was still standing, not while there were still kids in need of guidance, patience, and a second chance. Frank had already built the blueprint. Now it was Keanu's turn to carry the torch. Outside, the town was changing. Developers were circling, buildings going up. But this small shop would remain a reminder of what real strength looked like. Keanu took one last look around the space before heading out. He didn't need to say anything. Frank wouldn't have needed words. He simply rested his hand on the top of the toolbox, then tapped it once, softly, like a code they used to have. A thank you, a promise, and maybe, just maybe, a goodbye. The morning of the grand opening arrived, draped in a soft, overcast sky, the kind that made colors feel deeper, more personal. Keanu stood just inside the newly restored garage, now called the Donovan Center for Skills and Service. The air still held a faint trace of motor oil and sawdust, mixed with fresh paint and something harder to define: hope. It had taken months. Endless city meetings, community planning, calls to contractors and youth program coordinators. But the vision had taken shape. and the heart of it remained untouched. The original garage structure was preserved. The same beams, the same layout. Even the dent in the back wall where a tire rack once stood had been left untouched, cleaned but not erased. Rows of tools now gleamed from polished pegboards. Long wooden workbenches stretched beneath windows. One corner held refurbished bikes waiting for kids to tune up. Another held laptops for classes on design and budgeting. The space felt like a bridge, linking the old and the new, the past and what still could be. Outside, a small crowd was gathering. Local press, town council members, students, old friends of Frank's, and strangers drawn by the story. Leo stood beside Keanu, holding a clipboard with the schedule. "Nervous?" he asked. Keanu shook his head. Not nervous, just grateful. The ribbon was strung across the front entrance, crisp red and perfectly tied. At the center of it stood Patricia, elegant and steady, holding the ceremonial scissors. Her smile was quiet, her eyes wet. She had picked out her dress carefully that morning, one Frank had always liked. Blue with tiny white flowers. "He would have said it didn't need ironing," she'd laughed when Keanu picked her up. A few volunteers passed around programs printed with a photo of the original garage, Frank leaning in the doorway with a young Keanu sitting cross-legged beside him. Below the image, the words, "Built with quiet hands, remembered with full hearts." As the last few guests settled, the mayor stepped forward and welcomed everyone. He said a few words about heritage and growth, about how places change, but character stays. Then it was Keanu's turn. He stepped toward the microphone, hands relaxed at his sides, the wind catching a bit of his jacket. He didn't have a written speech. He never did for things like this. Just a heart full of memories. Keanu took a quiet breath as he faced the crowd. The microphone picked up the subtle crackle of a distant car engine and the soft rustling of folding chairs. For a moment, he just looked around. His eyes passed over young teens who reminded him of himself at 15. Older men with grease under their fingernails. Teachers, neighbors, people who still remembered what Frank Donovan had done for them without ever asking for anything back. "This garage," Keanu began slowly, "was never about fixing cars." A few people in the crowd nodded. It wasn't about turning bolts or tightening belts. It was about showing up, about patience, about doing things with your hands that eventually reached your heart. He glanced back at the building, then continued. "I came here as a kid who didn't know where I fit. I was angry, quiet, unsure of everything. Frank didn't try to change me. He didn't try to fix me. He just gave me space. And over time, he gave me something I didn't know I needed. Discipline, confidence, purpose." Keanu paused, his voice steady but warm. "He did that for dozens of us, maybe hundreds, and he never once asked for his name on anything." A quiet laugh passed through the group. "That's why it's on the building now." He gestured to the new sign above the garage. "The Donovan Center for Skills and Service." Letters hand-painted by local artists and students traced over the exact placement of the old Frank's Garage sign. It was different, yes, but also the same. "This place is for the ones who don't always get noticed," Keanu continued. "The ones who learn by doing, the ones who might need a second chance, or a first." A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. He finished simply, "This isn't about tools. It's about hands that learn to build and hearts that learn to serve." With a nod, he stepped back. Patricia took her cue. She stepped forward with the scissors, her hands firm despite the tremble Keanu could see in her shoulders. She didn't speak, just looked at the sign once more, then down at the ribbon. And with a single snip, she cut it clean. The crowd clapped softly. Not a roar, not a celebration of celebrity. It was quieter than that. More like respect. After the ribbon fell, the doors were opened wide. People wandered in slowly, hesitant at first, as if afraid they might disturb something sacred. They walked past the polished workbenches, the lined-up tool racks, and the photo wall near the back where Keanu had placed the same old Polaroids Frank once taped up. Kids walked the space wide-eyed, touching socket sets and wrenches like museum pieces. Volunteers handed out small cards with affirmations written in Frank's handwriting, copied from old notes Patricia had saved. Things like, "Every machine has a fix," and "Take care of your tools. They'll take care of you." Leo stood near the registration desk, already fielding sign-ups for the first week of programs: auto repair, bicycle building, woodworking, and mentorship lunches. One boy, maybe 13, looked up and asked, "Can I come even if I don't know how to fix anything?" Leo smiled. "That's exactly why you should come." In a quiet corner, Patricia sat with two of Frank's oldest friends. One held a folded paper towel with a grease stain on it. He used to say, "Real men don't need titles, they need torque," the man chuckled. Patricia wiped her eyes and said, "He always liked making up sayings like that." Keanu stood outside for a moment, leaning against the side of the building. He watched a father explain a set of calipers to his daughter, watched a teen help a younger boy put on safety goggles. The space was alive again. And Frank's presence. It wasn't just in the name on the sign. It was in every person who entered. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the last visitors filtered out, Keanu walked back inside. He flipped off the lights one by one. The shop quieted around him. On the central workbench sat a single framed quote in carved wood. "You don't just build engines, you build lives." He reached out, brushed a speck of dust off the corner, and let the silence settle. The Donovan Center had officially opened. But more importantly, Frank's work hadn't ended. It had only just begun. 3 weeks after the opening ceremony, Keanu returned to the Donovan Center without calling ahead. He wore a hoodie and jeans, the kind that blended in instead of stood out. No press, no entourage, just him, walking quietly through the side gate like he used to when he was a kid. The garage doors were rolled up, letting in the spring light. The inside buzzed with low music and even lower conversation, focused, steady. He stopped near the back wall, just beside the old toolbox station, and watched. There were kids everywhere, maybe 10 or 12, from different backgrounds and ages. One group was gathered around a row of lawnmower engines, half disassembled and laid open like puzzles waiting to be solved. Another set of teens worked on patching worn-out bike tires. A boy and girl huddled over a stripped screw, deep in concentration. It smelled the same. Grease, metal, sawdust, soap, like discipline, curiosity, and sweat all rolled into one. Keanu leaned against the wall and just watched. The instructor, a woman with gray streaks in her ponytail and grease smudges on her forearms, guided a young girl, maybe 15, through a tire replacement. The girl's hands shook slightly as she tried to loosen a rusted bolt. The instructor smiled, not stepping in too soon. Frank used to say, "If you can fix a bolt, you can fix a mistake." The girl froze. Then she gripped the wrench tighter. The bolt popped loose with a soft crack. A few of the other kids clapped. The girl laughed nervously, brushing hair from her forehead. She looked like she couldn't believe she did it. Keanu smiled, not out of pride but memory. He had been that kid, that bolt, that moment. The instructor gently handed the girl a rag and pointed to the next step. No micromanaging, no pressure, just the same rhythm Frank always used. One lesson at a time, one kid at a time. Keanu turned to scan the back wall. It had changed. Where the wall of names had once been, now hung black and white portraits of the new generation, each child holding a tool, standing beside their first repair. Below it was a wooden plaque, recently carved. Skills build more than things, they build people. And beside that, a corner display just for girls in trades. Helmets, gloves, a label, Rosie's Rack. On the hammer, a note taped gently, strong hands, soft heart. Keanu's throat tightened. Frank would have loved this. Keanu stayed at the back, unseen. That's how Frank always did it too, watching from the shadows, speaking only when it mattered. It wasn't about being noticed. It was about knowing that something you built was standing strong without you. A boy with buzzed hair and a shy grin approached the workbench. His name tag read Ravi. He hesitated before picking up a socket wrench, glancing toward the instructor as if asking permission. She didn't give him a lecture or a checklist. She just nodded once and said, "Figure it out with your hands." That's how Frank liked it. Keanu watched Ravi crouch next to an engine, inspecting it closely. He didn't rush. He didn't fake it. He asked a girl beside him for help. She showed him, then handed over the wrench without a word. No competition, just learning, just community. And then, behind Keanu, a voice spoke softly. It was Leo, the teacher who had written the letter that started this all. "You'd be proud of this," Leo said. Keanu nodded. He built the blueprint. Leo folded his arms. "You followed it?" They stood in silence for a moment, watching the kids laugh and struggle and sweat. "Home of them," Leo said, pointing toward a lanky teen, elbow deep in a busted carburetor. "He used to skip school every week. But since this place opened, he's here every morning before we even unlock the gate." Keanu's voice was low. "That's what happens when someone believes in you before you believe in yourself." Leo glanced sideways. "That was Frank for you, huh?" Keanu didn't answer right away. His gaze had wandered again to the far end of the shop, where a new tool cabinet had been installed. On top of it was a framed photo. Frank in his younger years, standing beside the original garage sign, arms slung over Keanu's teenage shoulders. Keanu stepped forward slowly and looked at it. Underneath, a metal plate read, "In memory of Frank Donovan, the man who taught us how to build more than engines." He touched the frame gently, as if grounding himself in it. A bell rang from the entrance. More kids were arriving, laughing, tossing their backpacks onto the shelves by the door, grabbing gloves and goggles. It was a school day, but this place had become something more. A haven, a launch pad, a second chance. And Keanu knew in that moment that Frank's legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was still breathing. Right here. As the day wore on, Keanu continued to watch, not as a celebrity, but as a student returning to the place that once shaped his soul. He stepped outside and leaned against the frame of the garage, eyes scanning the yard where he'd once ridden bikes with crooked handlebars and scraped-up knees. He remembered Frank's voice, calm, patient, never needing to be loud to be strong. Inside, a kid dropped a tool. It clattered to the ground. "Oops," someone called, followed by laughter. The instructor didn't scold. She just said, "Pick it up, try again. That's what we do here." Keanu looked toward the sky. The clouds were breaking. A little sun shone down on the Donovan Center, casting long shadows over the gravel lot. It felt right. It felt like Frank. Just before leaving, Keanu walked back inside. He found a quiet moment and left something on the pegboard near the exit. An old wrench from his teenage days. Still etched faintly on the handle were the initials K.R. Beside it, he taped a note. "To the next kid who thinks they're not good enough. This tool built my confidence. Use it to build yours." He stepped back, took a deep breath, and gave one last look around. Every corner of the garage had been touched by someone Frank once helped, and now it was filled with kids who would carry that same light forward, each one learning not just how to fix things, but how to fix parts of themselves. Quietly, humbly, one bolt at a time, Keanu exited through the side door, same as he'd come in. As he walked away, the garage behind him echoed with the sound of laughter, tools clinking, and young voices trading advice. The rhythm of purpose. He didn't need applause, didn't need to be seen. He just needed to know it was still standing, still doing what Frank always intended. He got into his truck, took one last look in the rearview mirror, and whispered, "Still teaching, old man." Then he smiled and drove on. The following weekend, Keanu returned to the Donovan Center, this time with no agenda. Just a quiet need to stand in that space again. The air still smelled of oil and pine cleaner. The light through the garage windows painted long, warm lines across the cement floor. He walked slowly, his boots echoing in the space that once taught him how to move through the world. At the far wall, a new bronze plaque gleamed under a soft spotlight. Keanu paused in front of it, breath catching. Frank Donovan. He fixed more than engines. He rebuilt lives. The engraving was clean but not polished, as if to reflect Frank's nature. Never flashy, always solid. Beneath it, a display had been carefully restored. The wall of Polaroids had returned. Someone had gently cleaned and reframed the photos of the boys and girls Frank had mentored over the years. Names were typed now beneath each one. A small laminated legend helped visitors match the faces to stories. Firefighter, social worker, teacher, welder. Keanu took a step closer. His own photo had been added, not from a movie set, not in a tuxedo. It was a candid shot, maybe from age 15. He stood beside Frank, grease on his cheek, a spark plug in hand, beaming at something just outside the frame. And beside that, a new addition, a larger photograph, printed with care and placed at the center of it all. Frank and young Keanu sitting on the curb outside the original garage. Frank wore his usual work shirt and had one arm stretched along the back of the bench behind Keanu. The boys' feet didn't even reach the ground. They were laughing, heads turned toward each other, lost in some forgotten joke. Keanu swallowed hard. Above it, mounted high and proud, was the original sign. Frank's Garage, open doors, open hearts. It had been cleaned, the letters touched up with fresh black paint, but the wood still bore the same cracks and weather. Keanu stepped beneath it and placed one hand on the frame. He remembered the first time he saw that sign, years ago, from the back seat of his mom's beat-up sedan. He hadn't known it then, but everything was about to change. From behind him, a voice spoke softly. "I was hoping you'd stop by." It was Leo. He wore a button-down shirt, tucked into jeans, and held a folder in one hand. Keanu nodded, couldn't stay away. Leo walked beside Keanu, and for a moment, neither said anything. They just stood in front of the wall, letting the silence speak. "We kept every photo we could find," Leo finally said. "Some were tucked away in drawers, some mailed in by folks who'd moved across the country. One even came from someone living in British Columbia now. Frank helped his dad back in the 80s. Keanu smiled. "That sounds like him." Leo opened the folder he carried and handed Keanu a single sheet. A list of names and short bios. "We're adding these next. They've all volunteered to come speak here once a month, about their lives, about the things Frank taught them." Keanu scanned the list. A woman who ran a shelter, a man who now trained apprentices, a nurse who said Frank once told her, "Fixing people takes softer hands, but the same heart." "Did he ever know how much he did?" Keanu asked quietly. Leo hesitated. "I think he did. But it was enough for him to watch people drive away better than they arrived. That was his finish line." Keanu nodded. His eyes returned to the plaque above the wall. He traced the edge of the metal with his fingers. "He would have hated this," he said with a smirk. Leo chuckled. "Oh, absolutely. He'd say it was too much, then go polish it every Sunday when no one was looking." In the far corner of the garage, a small group of kids was gathered around a car engine on a teaching stand. One of the younger instructors demonstrated how to check for compression. The kids watched closely, some nodding, others wide-eyed. Keanu watched too. He remembered when that had been him, watching Frank explain how the engine wasn't just metal and fuel, it had rhythm, it needed care. And that lesson was always about more than machines. It was about people, patience, attention, respect. Leo placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. "Want to add your story to the wall?" Keanu turned toward him. "I already did. It's in the building. It's in these kids." Leo didn't argue, he just nodded. The hum of the garage filled the space again, kids laughing, tools clinking, voices of instruction echoing gently off the walls. Keanu took one last look at the plaque and smiled. Frank Donovan hadn't needed a monument. But this one felt right. Later that afternoon, the center grew quiet again as the kids were dismissed and the instructors packed up their tools. Keanu lingered in the garage, not quite ready to leave. He wandered past the shelves, each one now labeled and organized, but still carrying the marks of Frank's original system. Rusted nails driven in where hooks wouldn't hold, scribbled notes in fading black marker. Near the workbench, Keanu noticed a new addition. A small wooden frame had been nailed above the tool drawers, right beneath the photo of him and Frank. Inside the frame was an old quote, one Keanu recognized immediately. "The measure of a man isn't what he fixes, but what he chooses not to leave broken." Frank D. Keanu's throat tightened. He didn't remember Frank ever writing that down, but he'd said it more than once. Usually after helping someone who didn't ask for help, or giving a second chance to someone who'd already burned their first. In that moment, Keanu felt it again. That deep warmth that used to fill his chest when he'd look up from a greasy wheel well and see Frank watching, not judging, just being there. The kind of presence that required no words to say, "I believe in you." He walked back to the Polaroid wall and stood in front of the larger photo. Him and Frank on that bench, both laughing, the kind of laugh that comes when you feel safe, when you feel loved. The building may have changed. The world outside certainly had. But inside these walls, something had stayed the same. Before he left, Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photo he'd kept in his wallet since his 20s. It was one of him and Patricia, standing beside Frank in front of the original garage the day it opened to the public. Frank had one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly on Keanu's shoulder. Keanu pinned it to the board, no caption, no announcement. Just a memory returned to its rightful place. Then he looked at the plaque one more time and whispered, "You rebuilt more than lives, Frank. You rebuilt me." He turned, walked toward the garage doors, and stepped into the fading light. The house was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that made Keanu feel every second pass. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like it remembered something. Inside, he sat at his old writing desk, one he hadn't used in years. A small brass lamp cast a pool of light on the paper in front of him. In the center of the desk sat Frank's worn leather notebook, its edges frayed, its cover scarred by time and grease. Keanu had brought it home from the center, just for tonight. Tucked between its pages were loose receipts, old to-do lists, and one hand-drawn blueprint of a broken carburetor from 1984. Keanu opened a fresh page in his own journal and began to write. He didn't start with "Dear Frank." He simply began with the words that had lived in his chest for years. "I should have said this sooner." The pen scratched softly as he continued. "You never called yourself my father. You didn't need to. You showed me every day what that word could mean. You never told me what to do. You just did it first. And let me learn by watching." He paused, exhaled, and looked at a photo of Frank on the shelf. It wasn't staged, just a candid shot of him wiping his hands on a rag. A half-smile caught mid-thought. "I never said thank you for the bike you fixed when no one else had the time, or the way you let me cry without asking why. You had a way of making people feel safe just by being in the room. I don't know how you did that." The wind outside shifted again. Keanu's pen didn't stop. "I wish I'd told you more often that you mattered. I wish I'd asked you more about your life before us, before the garage, before you walked into ours. But I always thought there'd be time." He sat back, let the silence fall again. Then he leaned forward. "But I'm saying it now. Thank you for every minute, every lesson, every second you spent showing me how to live with purpose." He signed it simply. Then carefully, he folded the letter in thirds and pressed it flat with the palm of his hand. He looked at the old toolbox resting on the chair beside him, the one Frank had left behind, the one that still smelled like oil and dust and memory. He opened the lid. Inside the old metal toolbox were tools worn smooth by time, tools that had taught Keanu more about life than any textbook or teacher ever could. A set of sockets with initials etched in the handles, a flathead screwdriver with the rubber worn thin, a bent wrench that still worked perfectly because Frank had once said, "A good tool doesn't need to be pretty, just honest." Keanu gently set the folded letter on top of the tools. He rested his hand on it for a moment, then slowly closed the lid. The hinges creaked the way they always had, soft and familiar. He reached for the small key Frank had kept on a chain above his workbench and turned it in the lock until it clicked shut. His voice broke the silence. "This is yours." He didn't need to say more. It wasn't a grand farewell or a dramatic moment. It was simple, like Frank, like the lessons he'd passed on with every movement, every quiet act of kindness. This was Keanu's way of handing something back, something unspoken that had always lived between them. Keanu stood, lifted the toolbox carefully, and carried it to the trunk of his car. That night, under a sky full of stars, he returned to the center. No one was there. The security lights cast a faint glow over the lot, and the Donovan Center stood quiet and proud in the dark. Keanu unlocked the main entrance with his copy of the key and walked through the echoing space until he reached the workshop. The polished floors still held the scent of cedar and oil. The air hummed with the memory of conversations past, laughter, questions, the clatter of tools. He walked to Frank's old workbench. It had been restored but not replaced. The same grooves ran across the surface, the same initials carved faintly into the edge, FD. Keanu placed the toolbox down, right where it used to sit. He didn't open it again. Instead, he stood for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the bench, the room, the plaque above the Polaroid wall. Then he stepped back, whispered, "Good night, Frank," and turned off the lights. As he walked away, the only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock above the doorway, one Frank had repaired a dozen times. Still working, still right on time. The next morning, the sun rose over the Donovan Center in soft golds and silvers, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Keanu returned just after sunrise, walking the perimeter quietly, his hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't come to speak, he came to watch. Inside, a janitor was already sweeping. A few early volunteers began prepping for the afternoon classes. In one corner of the main hallway, a small frame display had been added overnight, by someone anonymous. It held a photocopy of Frank's earliest business license and a faded snapshot of him in uniform, leaning against a motorcycle, his hand shielding the sun. Beneath it, a handwritten quote had been pinned. "Honor isn't earned by applause, it's earned by showing up, every single day." Keanu paused when he saw it. He smiled, recognizing the handwriting. Patricia's. He made his way toward the main room again, past rows of student lockers, past a mural half-painted by local kids. When he reached the garage floor, everything felt exactly how Frank would have wanted it. The old bench, the open bay doors, the chalkboard with instructions from yesterday's lesson still faintly visible. He walked to the toolbox, still sitting where he'd left it. He didn't open it this time either, but he did place something new on top. A small bronze keychain engraved with a phrase Frank had once told him before his first audition. "Go with courage, come back with lessons." Keanu took a breath and stepped back. He looked around one final time, then walked toward the exit. As he pushed the door open, a group of teens were coming up the walkway, laughing, nudging each other, carrying books and bags of lunch. One of them held the door for Keanu. "You coming in today, sir?" the boy asked with a grin. Keanu shook his head gently. "Not today." The kid nodded. "Okay. We'll take care of it." Keanu turned away with a quiet smile. "I know you will." He walked to his car as the sound of young voices filled the building behind him. Before he got in, he glanced back. The plaque above the doorway caught the morning light. Frank Donovan. He fixed more than engines, he rebuilt lives. And below it, etched into the frame, "Open doors, open hearts, always." Keanu stood there for a few seconds longer, then whispered under his breath, "Thank you for raising me," and drove off into the day. The night was cool and still as Keanu drove through the old neighborhood, the headlights of his car washing gently over the cracked pavement. He wasn't headed anywhere specific, not at first. He just needed air, silence, a moment to himself. He hadn't planned to stop, but as he passed the corner of Elmont and Riverside, his foot eased off the gas. There it was. The Donovan Center stood quiet under the moonlight, wrapped in shadows and memory. The garage door was closed for the evening, but a soft amber light glowed just above the entryway. A single fixture, the kind Frank used to keep on even when the shop was closed. Just in case someone needs to find their way, he used to say. Keanu pulled over without thinking, easing the car into the side lot. He turned off the engine and let the stillness settle around him. No music, no calls, just the hum of street lamps and the faint chirp of crickets in the distance. He leaned back in the seat, eyes fixed on the glowing light. It wasn't grand or bright. It was soft, modest, steady, exactly like Frank. The light didn't flicker. It didn't shout for attention. It just existed, constant, reliable. A beacon not for the masses, but for anyone who happened to pass by and wonder if they were welcome. Keanu's hands rested on the steering wheel, but his mind wandered far from the car. He thought of all the times he'd seen that light as a boy, how it had signaled the end of another day spent learning how to shape not just tools and bolts, but patience, resilience, and decency. He thought about the kids inside now, new names, new faces. He wondered what their stories were, who they were becoming, and whether they had any idea that someone, years before, had sat in their same seats, stared at those same tools, and come out the other side better for it. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A kid on a bike, maybe 12, 13 years old, pedaled by slowly, glancing toward the center. He looked curious, not in a rush, like he was thinking about turning in. The boy caught sight of Keanu's parked car and raised a hand in a quiet wave. Keanu returned it without hesitation. The boy smiled and rode on. And in that one small exchange, something in Keanu's chest settled, like a hand gently placed over the heart. Keanu stayed parked, letting the night stretch on around him. He didn't need to go inside. He'd seen enough, felt enough. That glowing light above the door, simple, warm, was more powerful than any ceremony or tribute. It reminded him that legacy doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly, like an engine tuned perfectly, waiting patiently to serve. The boy on the bike circled back once, paused at the sidewalk, and looked again at the building. He didn't get off the bike, but he stopped pedaling just long enough to study the old sign above the door. Open doors, open hearts. Keanu could almost hear Frank's voice saying it aloud, gravelly and soft. He wondered how many times Frank had watched a young person pause at that threshold, scared, unsure, maybe full of anger or loss, and still open the door without question. He remembered a moment from years ago, one he hadn't thought about in decades. He had broken his mother's kitchen clock trying to fix it as a child. He was terrified to tell her, so he brought it to the garage, hiding it in his jacket. Frank had taken one look, chuckled softly, and said, "Let's see if time can be mended." They never told Patricia. But Frank had shown him something greater than mechanical skill that day. He showed him grace, that mistakes didn't define him, that even broken things could be made whole again with patience. It was the kind of lesson you never really forget, even if it sleeps quietly inside you for years. Keanu leaned his head back against the seat and exhaled slowly. All the speeches, the donations, the ribbon cutting, none of it compared to what he felt right now, sitting alone in the dark, across from a place that had built him. He could hear Patricia's voice in his head again, from one of their last talks. Frank wasn't loud, but he left echoes. And that was exactly it. The light stayed on, the street remained quiet. The moments stretched, and Keanu stayed still, not wanting to move too quickly, not wanting to break the silence that felt so much like Frank himself, constant, kind, and full of unspoken strength. He closed his eyes for a moment and let it surround him. The light never wavered. After a while, Keanu stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched softly beneath his boots as he walked across the lot toward the garage. He didn't unlock the door. He didn't need to go inside to feel the heartbeat of the place. Just being near it was enough. He stood under the light, its gentle glow casting a soft shadow on the pavement. Up close, the old fixture looked like it hadn't been changed in decades. Keanu smiled. It was exactly like Frank to keep things running far longer than most would think possible. He would have said, "If it ain't broke, let it shine." Keanu looked up at the light, letting it warm his face. In the silence, the world felt suspended. Time felt different here. Slower, truer. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded note. It was the speech he'd written for the center's opening day, the one he ended up not using. He thought maybe he'd post it somewhere, or read it aloud. But none of that had felt right. Now he unfolded the paper and quietly read it to the night. Frank never asked to be remembered. He just hoped we'd remember how to care. He folded the note again and gently tucked it into the mailbox beside the door, a small weathered tin box with peeling paint and a dent near the hinge. Frank never replaced it. "Still does the job," he would say. Keanu took one last look at the center, its walls stronger, its spirit intact, and turned to leave. As he reached the car, he looked back once more. That same boy on the bike was riding by again, this time slower, more thoughtful. He gave another small wave, this time with a smile of recognition. Keanu waved back again, something hopeful rising in his chest. The boy turned the corner and vanished into the quiet street, but the feeling stayed. It was the same feeling Keanu had felt all those years ago walking home from Frank's garage. Lighter, taller, more like himself. He got into the car and closed the door gently. The engine hummed to life, but he didn't drive off immediately. He just sat there, watching the light. And then, softly, as if to himself, he whispered, "Still does the job." He smiled and drove into the night, carrying the echo of that quiet glow with him. It was a quiet afternoon when Keanu brought Patricia back to the center. The sky was painted in soft tones of amber and coral, the kind of sky Frank would have paused under, hands in his pockets, just listening to the world. The Donovan Center had been open for nearly 2 months now, and this was Patricia's first time visiting since the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Keanu parked in the same spot he used to ride his bike past when he was a kid. As he helped Patricia out of the car, she looked at the building, restored, vibrant, humming with life. The sign above the entrance read, "The Donovan Center for Skills and Service." Below it, the old wooden sign from Frank's original garage still hung, lovingly refinished. Open doors, open hearts. They stepped through the doors together. Inside, laughter and voices echoed off the high walls. The air smelled faintly of oil and sawdust, just like it used to. A group of teens gathered around a car lifted on a jack, listening to a volunteer explain how to replace a brake pad. Tools clinked. Someone turned up the radio a little. Patricia walked slowly, her hand tracing the familiar textures of the walls. Her steps were steady but reverent, like walking through a church built of memory. She stopped in front of the bronze plaque near the main entrance and leaned in to read it aloud. Frank Donovan. He fixed more than engines, he rebuilt lives. Her fingers hovered over the name, trembling slightly. She blinked back tears. "He never asked for credit," she whispered, voice soft. Keanu stood beside her, one hand on the small of her back. "But he earned it." Patricia nodded, her gaze still on the plaque. "He never told me he was planning to leave this behind." "He probably didn't plan to," Keanu said. "He just lived it." They moved to the far end of the workshop, where the wall of Polaroids had been carefully restored. Dozens of old photographs had been cleaned and remounted. Frank with kids, Frank showing how to hold a wrench, Frank handing out water bottles in the summer heat. Among the old photos were new ones, of the first kids who had joined the reopened center, grinning with oil-slicked fingers and wide eyes. A small crowd of students passed by, nodding respectfully to Patricia. One of them, a girl around 15, stopped and smiled. "You must be Frank's family," she said. Patricia smiled back. "We are." The girl pointed to a photo on the wall, a new one, where she stood holding a wrench, her smile beaming beneath grease-streaked cheeks. "He didn't teach me directly," she said, "but I feel like I know him." Patricia studied the photo and nodded. Then, "He's still doing his work." They made their way outside, where a few kids were cleaning tools and sweeping up. Keanu led his mother toward a small bench tucked beneath a maple tree that had once shaded Frank's favorite break spot. The wood was smooth and clean, and a brass plate glinted in the light. "In memory of Frank Donovan, built by hands that gave, not took." Patricia sat down slowly, and Keanu followed. The two of them sat side by side, watching the rhythm of the place unfold. Students came and went through the wide garage doors. Volunteers chatted softly under the awning. There was no chaos, no noise, just motion, just purpose. Keanu leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "You know," he said quietly, "there were times I wondered if I was ever going to live up to what he saw in me." Patricia looked at him. "You have?" He hesitated. "I don't think he ever wanted me to be anyone but myself." She smiled. "That was his gift, Keanu. He didn't push. He didn't mold. He just revealed. He let people find who they were meant to be." Keanu looked out across the lot. "I keep hearing him in my head lately. Whenever I get tired or unsure, I hear him say, 'Don't wait, just show up.'" Patricia chuckled softly. "I still hear him in the kitchen when something breaks, telling me to stop using duct tape and start using sense." They both laughed, and for a moment the weight of memory became warmth. A breeze rustled the maple leaves above them, whispering the soft hush of fall's approach. Keanu stood up and glanced at the sun dipping toward the horizon. "He'd say it's almost dark, time to get back to work." Patricia looked at him, her eyes misty but strong. "Then go." He paused, searching her expression. She added, "That's what he taught you to do. Not just fix things, but keep things going. Lives, people, community." Keanu nodded. Then he bent down, kissed his mother's cheek, and stepped toward the garage once more, the light from its open doors glowing across the pavement like an invitation. Keanu stepped back inside the Donovan Center, but this time, he didn't look for anyone. He just stood quietly in the entryway, breathing in the air that still carried hints of motor oil, sawdust, and something older, memories baked into the walls. A group of kids was gathered around a stripped-down go-kart frame. One of the instructors, maybe mid-30s, with sleeves rolled up and smudges across his jeans, was pointing to the drive chain while asking a question. Instead of explaining, he handed the tool to a boy no older than 10 and simply said, "Let's try it your way." Keanu watched. That was Frank's way. Never hand them the answer. Hand them the chance. He moved past the workstations and toward the back wall, where the new photo of him and Frank hung next to the original Polaroids. The image had been enlarged, framed, with old garage bolts embedded in the border. It showed a teenage Keanu, arms crossed but grinning, standing beside Frank, who was mid-laugh, holding a wrench like a scepter. For a moment, Keanu reached out and touched the glass. Next to it hung a handwritten quote on a plaque. "Some people wait for applause, others wait for someone to pass them the wrench. FDD." Keanu turned and took in the full room. Students fixing, teachers listening, machines humming. This wasn't a memorial, it was a continuation. He walked past the benches and shelves toward the small corner where Frank used to sit for lunch. The old stool was still there. Next to it, on a newly built display, sat Frank's original lunch pail, restored and preserved. Inside were items donated by students and staff: a folded bandana, a socket wrench, an old spark plug, and one item no one had touched: a folded note that simply read, "Thanks for waiting for us to catch up." Keanu smiled through the ache in his throat. He didn't speak. There was no speech left to give. Instead, he stepped back, gave a nod to the room, and headed for the doors. As he stepped out, the sky was deep orange. The maple tree cast long shadows. Patricia was still on the bench, hands in her lap, eyes closed like she was listening to an echo that only she could hear. Keanu stood beside her in silence. Neither of them needed to say anything more. Frank had already said it all, and now it was living on, in hands that knew how to build, in hearts that knew how to serve. The sun had barely crested the rooftops when Leo arrived early at the Donovan Center. The place was quiet, still wearing the hush of dawn. He liked it that way. The silence gave him time to breathe, to prepare before the buzz of voices and toolkits took over. There was always something sacred about those early hours, as if the walls remembered the man who had shaped generations within them. Leo moved through the garage with practiced ease. A few freshly cleaned sockets lined the edge of a workbench, left neatly by a student the night before. He smiled, nodding with pride at the habit of care that was taking root. He passed the photo wall, pausing briefly on the Polaroid of his younger self, a wiry boy in a patched denim jacket, grinning beside Frank with a socket wrench in his hand. It still felt surreal to be the one teaching here now. He made his way into the small office in the back, a space Frank had rarely used, preferring to work alongside the kids on the floor. Still, the office had been preserved, updated just enough to make room for lesson plans and student forms. On the old wooden desk sat a pile of unopened mail, a couple of invoices, and something else, something different. A yellowed envelope rested at the edge of the drawer. It looked out of place, worn but deliberate. Across the front, in Frank's firm, slanted handwriting, were the words, "For the one who stays." Leo stared at it, throat suddenly dry. He opened the envelope slowly, careful not to tear the corners. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. A brass key fell into his palm. He recognized it instantly. It was the key to the tool cabinet that had always remained locked during Frank's time. No one had ever been allowed to open it without Frank's say. The note was short, no fanfare, just Frank's voice on the page, steady and true. "You don't need to be perfect. Just present. If you're here, you're already enough." Leo blinked hard. A lump formed in his chest, unshakable. It was the kind of message that didn't just land. It settled. Warm, heavy, true. He looked around the small office, the memories thick in the air. Then he sat down at the desk, the same one Frank had used, now his, and placed the note under the glass surface, right in the center. He whispered, "I stayed, Frank." The center began to stir with life as the morning rolled in. Leo stood and walked to the large garage doors, sliding one open to let in the early light. Dust danced in golden beams that poured across the concrete floor. One by one, students filtered in, laughing, yawning, clutching coffee cups, or rolling in on bikes they had tuned themselves. Leo greeted each of them with a nod or a warm pat on the back, letting their energy fill the space like fresh air. They trusted him, not because he demanded it, but because he showed up every day. He wasn't Frank. He never pretended to be. But he'd learned that showing up, just being there, with steady hands and an open heart, was sometimes more than enough. The note had made that truth settle deeper in his bones. He had always feared he wasn't worthy of carrying on Frank's legacy, but maybe that was never the point. At lunch, a few of the students gathered around a broken mower. One of them, a girl named Sadie, with grease already streaked across her forehead, held up a stripped bolt and asked, "Leo, how do you fix a mistake like this?" Leo smiled. "Well, Frank used to say, every broken part is just a lesson waiting to be understood." He crouched beside her, showing her how to use the extractor kit. "Don't rush it. Let the thread tell you what it needs." Sadie nodded slowly, her frustration easing. The others watched closely, mirroring the same quiet attention Frank once drew from them all. Later that afternoon, Leo wandered back to the office again. The toolbox with Frank's key sat in the corner, untouched. For weeks he hadn't opened it. He wasn't sure why. Maybe part of him wanted to wait for the right moment. But now, with the letter beside him and the voices of kids echoing from the shop floor, he realized it was time. He turned the key. The metal clicked softly. Inside, everything was labeled, neatly, intentionally. Wrenches wrapped in cloth. A box of pencils marked ideas. A pair of old gloves, still dusted with grease. And at the very bottom, a small tin labeled, "First Bolts." He opened it. Inside were a handful of mismatched bolts. No note, no explanation, just a memory from years ago. Frank helping him with his very first repair. These were the pieces he'd used. Frank had kept them. Leo stood in the center of the office, toolbox open, hands trembling. It wasn't about fixing machines. It never had been. It was about remembering, about presence, about building something that would outlive them both. And now, it was his. That evening, when the last student had gone and the echoes of laughter had settled into silence, Leo sat at the glass-topped desk in the center's small front office. The sun was beginning to dip, casting a golden hue across the polished floor and reflecting off the rows of hanging tools along the wall, each one labeled with Frank's careful handwriting. In his hands, Leo held the note one more time. "You don't need to be perfect, just present." He gently smoothed out the creases and slid it beneath the glass surface of the desk, placing it where his eyes would always find it when things got hard. He set the key beside it. Then, from the bottom of the toolbox, he retrieved one final item. An old pocket knife with initials etched faintly on the side. F.D. Leo placed that beside the note too. A small plaque had been mounted just above the office doorway earlier that week. It read, "The Donovan office, in honor of the quiet ones who showed up." He looked around. The garage lights were off now, except for the one that always stayed on. Frank's night light above the door. The same one Keanu had paused under just nights ago. It cast a soft glow over the concrete, a silent beacon in the dark. Leo stood and walked back into the main bay. There, hanging on the far wall, was a new addition to the wall of Polaroids. It showed Leo, much younger, with crooked glasses and a face smeared in oil, holding up a perfectly repaired bicycle wheel. Frank stood behind him in the photo, one hand on Leo's shoulder, the other giving a quiet thumbs up. Leo stared at it a long time. Then he walked to the whiteboard near the entrance and picked up a marker. He wrote a new quote at the top. The one Frank had whispered to him years ago when he had nearly walked out of the garage for good. "If you can fix a bolt, you can fix a mistake." He stepped back, capped the marker, and turned off the final light. The garage would open again tomorrow. More kids would come. More bolts would be stripped. More lessons would be learned. And in every quiet moment of guidance, every small victory and failure, Frank Donovan's voice would echo, not loudly, but clearly. Leo locked the door behind him, the toolbox safe inside, and outside the night settled like a warm blanket over the Donovan Center. The late afternoon light filtered through the high windows of the garage, catching on dust particles that danced like memories. Keanu stood in the center of the room, alone but surrounded by everything that had shaped him. The workbenches were still sturdy, the toolbox still smelled faintly of oil and cedar, and the silence, the deep, peaceful kind, was the kind that didn't feel empty. It felt full, familiar. He walked slowly toward the far wall where Frank's old pegboard hung. Wrenches, screwdrivers, even the original torque wrench with Frank's initials etched into the handle, all neatly arranged. Keanu picked it up and ran his fingers over the cold steel. It was heavier than he remembered, or maybe the years had just given it weight. Each corner of the space whispered with memory, the laugh of a kid fixing his first bike chain, the soft hum of Frank's voice explaining how a carburetor breathes, the scent of coffee, always just a little burnt. It wasn't just a garage, it was a classroom. a sanctuary, a blueprint for manhood. He walked past the new benches, the freshly painted walls, the open bay doors that now welcomed light and life into what once stood quietly in the shadows. Every inch carried the story of a man who built more than engines. He built people. Keanu paused beside the photo wall. The old Polaroids, restored, remounted, now hung in a grid of names and smiles. At the center, a new frame. A photo of Frank, younger, arms folded, watching a young Keanu try to tighten a bolt with all his might. Frank's expression was unreadable then. Now Keanu knew it by heart. Pride, patience, presence. He looked over to the corner, where a small plaque gleamed on the wall. It read, "Frank Donovan. He fixed more than engines." Keanu reached out and placed his hand gently against it. He took a breath and stepped toward the bench where Frank used to sit, usually with a sandwich wrapped in foil and a thermos of black coffee. Keanu lowered himself onto the same spot, elbows resting on his knees. The quiet around him wasn't heavy. It was grounded, settled. From his jacket pocket, he pulled a folded sheet of paper. It was the letter he'd written months ago, the one he had placed in Frank's old toolbox. But he carried a copy with him, not for rereading, but for remembering, for anchoring. In the voiceover of his thoughts, Keanu's words played gently. "We all have someone who showed us how to hold steady when the world shook." He turned and looked around the shop again. Every repaired bolt, every painted wall, every carefully labeled tool now served not just as function, but as testimony. The legacy Frank left behind wasn't in the things he built. It was in the people he taught how to build. "Frank showed me," Keanu whispered, "that strength isn't loud. It's consistent." He stood again, stepping back into the middle of the room. His eyes softened as he turned to face forward, toward the door now propped open by a cinder block, just like in the old days. There was light outside, not the kind that burned, the kind that beckoned. He stepped forward. Keanu paused at the threshold, then turned back for one last look. The garage wasn't just standing, it was alive again, with memories, with voices that once filled the air, and with the hope that now passed from one generation to the next. The smell of old wood, faint oil, and fresh beginnings lingered in the quiet. On the counter beside the door sat a framed photo of Frank, young, grease on his cheeks, arms crossed, smiling beside a much younger Keanu in overalls. Next to it was a single wrench, polished from use, resting beside a brass plate that read, "He fixed more than engines." Keanu stepped closer and placed a hand on the counter. His fingers brushed against the cool metal of the wrench, then settled near the frame. The moment didn't need words. It was a goodbye and a thank you, all in one. Then, with a soft exhale, he turned toward the camera. "If this story moved you," he said gently, "like, share, and subscribe, and maybe say thank you to the one who shaped your path." He nodded once, then walked out into the sunlight. The camera lingered on the wrench beside the photo. A breeze lifted the edge of an old paper hanging from the wall. A work schedule from decades ago, with names handwritten by Frank. The screen faded to black, and in the quiet final frame, the wrench remained. Still. Ready, waiting for the next pair of hands.